Back in 2018, Avengers Infinity War was released. It was my favorite movie and still is one of my favorites, partially from bias maybe, but I remember it being the first instance that I watched a movie and actually understood the villain in the same way I understood the heroes. The movies and shows I'd watched before had villains that were either uninteresting or pure evil. Thanos' plan at face value was to kill half of all life in the universe, and seemed completely unjust, but his reasons said otherwise. He had the ideology of wanting everything to balance, that resources were finite and current life would use them all up. Obviously, his plan wasn't without flaws, as he forgot to account many things, but in general, it seemed to make sense, or at least you can understand why he's doing it. It made enough sense for people to think he's right, and that the Avengers were wrong. And in this way, Thanos is sort of an anti-hero. But in the 6 years since I've watched Infinity War, I've also fallen back in love with pure evil villains, or villains that have twisted morals and aren't morally relatable, but still understandable. There was a point where I thought that anti-heroes were the only good villains, and if you had a pure evil villain, it automatically meant the story was bad, or that the villain wasn't interesting at all. This isn't true, but I still love anti-heroes. Today I'm going to be talking about anti-heroes and why people idolize them, as well as when people idolize villains who aren't anti-heroes, which is pretty awkward. Although, let's be honest, idolizing any villain is kind of weird. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to another Peak Stasis video. Before I get started, I saw your guys' comments and I listened, so I got a new microphone. If you're a Peak Stasis fan or have watched any one of these videos, you'll know that I'm a big Attack on Titan fan. And if you know anything about Attack on Titan, mild spoiler, the main character is an anti-hero, and my personal, slightly biased favorite example. But why do people relate to anti-heroes, even if they don't entirely agree with their ideology? A pure evil villain, to provide contrast, is a villain that has motives that go against the moral compass of a human. Some broad examples of motives are to kill all humans, cause horrible torture to any amount of people for the sake of their own pleasure or some sense of obligation, destroy the world, destroy one particular type of person or thing for the sake of evil, etc. But they all have one thing in common. They are simply for the sake of evil. It isn't because the villain adopted some kind of twisted ideology, it is simply because they want as much evil as possible, and more likely than not, they want to be the one who orchestrates it. It sounds grand, and definitely can be grand, but it is never really as captivating as anti-heroes, in my opinion at least. Keep in mind that this explanation is just for the extreme example. But let's just take a second to talk about that. Are pure evil villains bad? Well, of course not. I believe that a full story with a pure evil villain should have examples of human evil within it. Basically meaning that the pure evil should not be the only force of evil in the story, and should have some other characters that are evil but not pure evil. They can also be quite interesting if done right, or if portrayed right. In Berserk, which is something that I also reference a lot, major spoilers, skip ahead to here to avoid it. Griffith is not pure evil, but when he turns into Femto, he is. Femto carries the same will as Griffith, to conquer a nation, except he literally sacrifices his humanity, as seen in the Lost chapter. This means Femto is literally Griffith, but without any good, and I think that's also an interesting example of pure evil. Anyway, back to anti-heroes. Why do people relate to them? Let's give a few examples of scenarios. Firstly, having complex or interesting backstories. A popular, although maybe not favorable to all, example is Darth Vader. In case you live under a rock, spoiler warning. Darth Vader is possibly the most recognizable villains ever, or at least one of. He is seen as pure evil or an ambiguously evil figure in A New Hope, but in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, as well as the second and third prequel movies, we can understand his motives and see his backstory. Whether the prequels were good or if his backstory was portrayed good is another video entirely, which is not a video that I'm going to be making because I'm not interested in it at all. The point is, despite all the evils that he did, like killing countless people, destroying entire planets, and causing destruction, he is somewhat relatable or understandable. He wasn't always evil, and even while he was evil, he still had a pillar of humanity. That's actually an interesting way to think of it. Anakin Skywalker sacrificed some of his pillars of humanity, but one still remained, his attachment to his son, which is something that many people directly relate to, or at least understand. This pillar was his last bastion of humanity, and the thing that was able to pull him back to the light side. The whole pulling back to the light side redemption was also very interesting. Another example is having relatable traits or some kind of relatable motive. An example is Walter White. Minor spoilers for Breaking Bad, but if you're kind of interested in watching it, these spoilers aren't a huge deal. At the beginning of the show, it is almost hard to watch because of how sad Walter seems to be in many cases. Hank is a cocky jerk. Walter lost the opportunity to become wealthy with one of his friends many years ago, and he just genuinely feels human. When he begins making meth, he still feels human, and we can understand why and feel tension, as up to this point, Walt doesn't seem like someone who'd sell meth. Because of this, we feel empathy, and we also feel tension when he almost gets caught, or almost offs himself. When he offs his first victim, we can feel his overwhelming sense of remorse and regret. He slowly falls to the dark world of selling drugs and committing crimes, but it is slow enough that we can empathize with him until at a certain point we realize what he has become. But in the first season or two, despite his decisions, it seems as if he really is doing it for his family, and that he simply wants to use his smarts to make money, even if maybe that proves to be wrong later in the show. Who knows? One of my personal favorite examples is moral graze. If we think of morality as a scale or a gradient, we can think of this end here as immoral and this end as moral. Light gray would be more moral with some immoral, and dark gray would be more immoral with just some moral. But what about closer to the center? It starts to become harder to tell if it's good or bad. If something is so immoral, yet backed with so much justification, it can fall into a moral gray. The entirety of Attack on Titan is an example of this, which if you haven't already, and like anime of course, please watch. But another example is Thanos. Killing half of all life is easily in the dark section of the gradient, but backed with justification and reason, it falls somewhere in the middle, although maybe slightly towards the darker end. All these characters, even if evil, can be understood or empathized with, and some people even idolize them, believing them to be truly right. Thanos was right, half of us should die. Walter White was right, he just wanted what was best. But would you let Walter run his business if it meant that a family member of yours would die or be put in danger, or potentially fall to addiction? Would you let Thanos snap if you realized that your family members, loved ones, and even you yourself could be snapped out of existence? At the very least, you would think twice about it, no doubt. The people who idolize these villains are not bad or wrong for doing so, maybe just misguided. But some people idolize other villains that are perhaps more unjustifiable. If you've been on the internet in recent times, you may have heard of a Sigma. I really hoped I would never have to say the word Sigma on this channel, but look at where we've come. This term originated, or at least had early and long-lived popularity with American Psycho, specifically Patrick Bateman, played by Christian Bale. Sigma was a term meant to better specifically men, used by gym advocates or people who tried to appear more masculine and mysterious, I guess. There was no surprise that this became extremely stereotyped and made fun of, but the point is, people idolized the term, and a lot of it was relating to Patrick Bateman. Now, I know a lot of these so-called Sigmas don't actually idolize Patrick Bateman himself, rather the idea of improving, but the origins of the term stem from a movie where the main character is a psychopathic and self-absorbed serial killer, even if at the end it's hinted that it was all in his head, which is weird, but that's an entirely different video that I'm also not going to be making. This was a weird example because most people truly don't idolize him or don't really know what they're idolizing. But one that caught my interest was Johann Liebert. Johann Liebert is a character from the anime or manga Monster. Monster is an incredible piece of fiction, and perhaps I will cover it in a future video. There will be a few spoilers, but nothing to ruin the show entirely, but if you really care, you can skip ahead to here. Johann Liebert is a calm, manipulative person. His upbringing was one of torment, where he was subject to experimentation in attempts to make him and other children perfect soldiers. His motives are that of pure evil perhaps, but I would consider him an example of truly interesting pure evil. He is manipulative, which is probably why people idolize him. People in recent times for some reason are so obsessed with the idea of manipulating everything. Maybe it's because they like manipulating people, or at least just to fantasize about it. But maybe it's because they want to believe they are in control of everyone, and that they are some kind of supreme being. But spoiler alert, Johann Liebert is no one that you should be idolizing. Johann Liebert is incredibly nihilistic, and quick major spoiler, skip ahead to here. His whole goal is to kill everyone who knows of his existence, and then kill himself, as if he never existed. He's given the nickname in the show the Nameless Monster because of this, which is really interesting. Another example is Light Yagami. He seems to be doing the right thing by killing all criminals, but he develops a god complex and thinks he can do whatever he wants. He thinks he's a god, and that he's bringing light to the world. But this whole video has been about empathizing over villains, even though you shouldn't idolize any villain. But maybe these criminals' circumstances only allowed for them to become the way that they are. Maybe killing them is a cruel way to believe that you are cleansing the world of evil, and it basically makes you seem like you're above everyone else and that you get to decide who lives and not.
Hello, Peak Stasis viewer, I am Jarem. It has come to my attention that Peak Stasis has talked poorly about idolizing villains. Unfortunately, I must disagree with him on this one. Sorry, Peak Stasis. Personally, I love idolizing villains. Villains have such a cool aura, and I wish to be exactly like them. I want to be mysterious and cool, and it seems the only way I can achieve such is by acting the way these villains do. I definitely understand these villains and what kind of people they are. Anyway, I'm going up this way. I guess this is goodbye. What? What the heck is that? Who are you?
I am Mr. Evil. I am going to do evil things. Do you understand?
Oh dear.
Now I will summon an evil creature.
What on earth are you? In that moment, I wondered what was happening. Is this what evil feels like?
Remember, no villain should be idolized, even the more understandable ones. But in general, people seem to idolize villains because they want to be like them. Villains can often appear cool and menacing, and many people wish they could be like that too. Some people take it a step further even, trying to employ these methods that the villain use to seem more mysterious. A common theme with these people is that they don't understand that they really don't want to be these villains. Living as Johann Liebert is undesirable as explained earlier. Being Light Yagami means you would have to carry the weight of potentially millions of deaths. And I know that most people who idolize the villains only idolize them for their mysterious and enigmatic nature and not their actual actions. But it's like saying, forgive me for such a crude example, that you idolize a former Chancellor of Germany, not for his actions, but for his mustache. But it's still odd that people idolize villains, isn't it? If we replace the term idolize with favor, we can better expand this question. For many shows and movies, as well as books, I often find myself finding villains more interesting than the heroes. Perhaps it's because in more recent times the stories I've been consuming have revolved around the evil people, but I believe it's because making an interesting villain is much easier to pull off for writers, or it can have potential to be much more interesting. This isn't a way to downplay well-written villains or heroes in general, but think about it. An average hero needs basic morals to be considered a hero. By the way, not every protagonist is considered a hero, and not every hero is basic like I'm outlining. Luke Skywalker is a great example of a character that is like this. Some may agree or not, but personally, Luke Skywalker isn't that interesting of a character to me. He's cool, but come on, Darth Vader's way cooler. A lot of the time, especially Luke Skywalker, the main character is just standard, morally good, following the hero's journey or some other archetype. Many tropes have been overdone in general, but specifically the main character tropes have gotten old, while the new fresh ideas for villains or fresh takes on old archetypes of villains continue to pop up. Another reason why villains are interesting is because they're so different to us a lot of the time. A hero will often have similarities to us in the sense of wanting good, not necessarily circumstance though, but seeing a villain and how they think while being completely different to us is quite interesting. In Monster, I absolutely hate Johann Liebert. The stuff he does is sick and immoral, yet the show is so addictive because of how calculated his actions are. Because Johann is so enigmatic for most of the show and so mysterious, it creates a really interesting character for him. Thank you for watching this Peak Stasis video. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to check out my other content, and if you enjoyed, please consider subscribing. This video took a long time to make. In fact, it probably took longer than any of my other videos. Thank you all, and I'll see you in the next Peak Stasis video.